Welcome to Etymologies of Care, a podcast about how language, awareness, culture, and relationship shape the way we exist in the world. I'm Paul Lichtenberg, and after more than 30 years as a clinical psychologist, I've learned that the most powerful changes occur not in isolation, but in meaningful, authentic relationships and how we think and express them. Here, we explore different ways of understanding and practicing care, from nervous system regulation to emotional development, to generating positive core beliefs, to spiritual fulfillment, to the power of authentic relating and community. Our hope is not to give you answers or solve seemingly incommensurate problems, but to spark curiosity in conversations that elevate awareness to help us all see ourselves and each other more clearly, more carefully. So let's begin. Welcome to Etymologies of Care. I'm Paul Lichtenberg. Before we get started on our journey together, let me share a bit about who I am and why this conversation matters to me personally. I've worn many different hats throughout my career: therapist, researcher, educator, and now podcast conversation partner. As a clinical psychologist, I started as a somewhat traditional psychotherapist, trained in individual deep dynamic therapy approaches, consistent with my own many-year therapy process. And though going deep into my own internal experience, I learned to believe that healing primarily occurred by fixing what was wrong inside people's minds, including mine. Over the years of practice, honestly, from the start, there were two primary things that troubled me. The first was just that in my core being, I knew there was nothing wrong with me. I intuitively knew that this family, this teacher, this school, this community, this world is somehow not in alignment. I suffered, but did not truly believe that I caused my suffering. As an adult, of course, I was and am responsible for transforming my suffering and accountable to the mistakes I make. And ultimately, I am alone responsible for integrating those painful parts of my life into my whole being. The second thing that troubled me is related to the first, and that is, it never really made sense that a successful therapeutic experience would end with merely a stronger sense of self. Rather, I intuited, therapy would begin with the self and flower into a more fluid sense of self that is integrally part of a greater vast web of a unified field of consciousness, or simply interconnectedness. These two profound connections especially made sense because I suffered throughout childhood and times in adulthood with a nagging isolation. That is, a core part of me felt internally disconnected from the relational world around me. And when I felt connected, the sense of isolation would dissolve. Later, and this was enhanced through my study of Buddhist philosophy, I came to realize that the language we use to describe reality as we know it and people's struggles seem to be creating limitations rather than possibilities. In other words, though the quality of my therapeutic relationships were deeply intimate, parts of my therapeutic language were unintentionally isolating and pathologizing. I have countless examples of how therapeutic or culturally normative language creates limitations. Here's a personal one I shared in my Substack post, "A River Runs Through It." After my father died when I was 12, I experienced what we typically call depression that lasted for several years, primarily because it went untreated. Here's an excerpt from "A River Runs Through It." Pat Lehman lived 3 doors down from us in a 2-block garden apartment complex in Queens. Pat was a nurse who came over not infrequently to comfort my father, to soothe him and talk him out of his unimaginably painful depressive states, or to get him to stop drinking. My father lived in the kitchen, a small but safely contained space with a window overlooking Pat's apartment below. He was a World War II veteran who, at 19, with hopes of being a medic, was picking up body parts in Okinawa and Tarawa. He suffered from alcoholism and addiction to prescribed drugs. He died of a heart attack at 46 when I was 12. This story was told 100 times in 100 ways during my entire 10-year analytic therapy journey. A few months before his death, he was drunk and harassing my mother. The young warrior I attacked him, pushing him away from my mother, banging on his chest and railing, "Leave my mother alone. I hate you. Go to hell. I hope you die." Adolescents express depression distinctly through irritability, anger, risk-taking behaviors like substance use, aggression, defiance. Social withdrawal, excessive screen time, and dramatic mood swings often mask underlying symptoms. Research shows that early intervention during adolescence is more effective than treatment later in life. And long-term outcomes of untreated adolescent depression are significant. But here's what I want you to understand. The language of depression potentially creates a limitation. It narrows a view to fixing my malfunctioning brain or mind, locating depression within the adolescent rather than examining how it might represent an intelligent response to developmental demands within inadequate relational conditions, and often perpetuates the shame of suffering. What was absolutely true for me, and for many adolescents and adults I've worked with over the years, is that my depression was a coherent sign of wisdom and self-protection, not because my parents failed me. Despite their desire to be authentic and responsible, they were part of systems of care that lacked relational literacy and access to proper support. You can see in my share two very distinct clinical approaches. The first focuses on symptoms. It might recommend medication, perhaps trauma-informed therapy, with language about healing the trauma, managing grief, reducing depressive symptoms. This locates the problem within me and aims to restore baseline functioning. The second approach recognizes that my downward spiral is actually my psyche's attempt to metabolize something unbearably complex. The simultaneity of loving my father, hating what his pain did to my family, carrying the weight of those final words, and losing him before any of it could be resolved. The painful emotions weren't symptoms to eliminate, but the meaning-making process itself. Now, this reframing opens completely different possibilities. Instead of, "You have depression that needs treatment," it becomes, "You're carrying enormous grief, guilt, and confusion that need to be understood within the larger context. My father's untreated war trauma, my family's systemic patterns, and what it means to be 12 years old, navigating all this alone." Now, I want to be absolutely clear. This is one clinical example that demonstrates a different way of understanding very painful symptoms. It is not an answer or solution to complex constellations of relational suffering. While my experience shows how painful emotions can become transformative meaning-making processes, some listeners experiencing acute depression or trauma might need the very real benefits of symptom reduction and immediate support and intervention. The IRH framework holds both truths, that emotions carry meaning and that sometimes people need immediate relief. The difference is how we think about suffering and the language we use for a true healing process. One, we say, that addresses how human beings, in all their complexity, naturally function. The distinction matters because the first approach exclusively might provide some relief, but keeps focus on individual symptom management. The second allows those utterly painful emotions to become meaning-making forces, transforming raw suffering into deeper understanding of human complexity, intergenerational trauma, the profound role of culture in etymologies of care, and ultimately, personal freedom. In my more traditional role, I realize that isolation isn't just in one's own mind and language. It is a byproduct of the very way culture conceptualizes how human beings function, and even how the mental health field does therapy, which we will explain throughout the podcast episodes, and which I write about extensively on Substack. Please look for me there. Related to this existential artifact of isolation, many therapists have agreed over the years. We therapists tend to work in isolation, and when we do collaborate, it is often not truly collaborative. And so I've worked with communities exploring how healing happens together, relationally, not just individuals in isolation. I am a supervisor, training other supervisors and therapists, discovering that how we talk about so-called mental health shapes what becomes possible in the therapy room. And I've been a student and am still a student, constantly learning from clients, colleagues, and communities about different ways of understanding human suffering and human flourishing. It all organically unfolded. When folks would say, I'm depressed or I'm chronically anxious, they weren't just describing symptoms. They were using language that located their distress within an isolated mind, separate from relationships, culture, and the conditions that actually gave rise to their experience. So, let's talk a bit about language. I was always fascinated by language and etymology, the origins and evolution of words, for example, as linguistic tools for uncovering the hidden assumptions embedded in our everyday language about mental health. In addition to language studies, I discovered that our current frameworks for understanding psychological distress were developed within specific historical and cultural contexts that may no longer serve us. Some examples include diagnostic categories from 19th century moralization, like hysteria, often used to pathologize women's emotional expression, or a current favorite is borderline personality disorder. Another example is individual pathology models from industrial capitalism, which emphasized getting individuals functional enough to return to work, rather than questioning whether work conditions themselves might be harmful. A third controversial example, and one highlighted in today's political discourse, is the nuclear family as the default relational unit. This traditional view sees the nuclear family as the natural, healthy social structure and pathologizes extended family systems like communal child rearing or non-heteronormative family arrangements that, by the way, were normative in many cultures and historical periods. A fourth example is one of the most analyzed in modern discourse, the separation of mind from body and spirit. This is a deeply philosophical term popularized as Cartesian dualism that is deeply embedded in Western medicine and which treats psychological distress as separate from physical health, spiritual meaning, or cultural belonging. An approach that doesn't align with how most world cultures understand human wholeness. And so, in this deep concern about language, the traditional mental health framework and desire to develop the new paradigm of healing, we developed what we call integrative relational psychotherapy and health. a framework that weaves together multiple knowledge traditions, connects physiological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions, and honors both scientific precision and lived experience, while recognizing that healing emerges not within isolated minds, but through the quality of our connections with ourselves, others, and our communities across diverse contexts of care. Etymologies of Care. In creating this podcast, we began with a fundamental question. What draws people to question conventional mental health frameworks? Many listeners find themselves recognizing patterns that suggest our current approaches may be incomplete in the following ways. 1. Diagnostic labels and symptom-focused treatments don't capture how distress actually emerges through relationships, cultural conditions, and environmental factors. 2. Mental health practitioners feel restricted by approaches that locate problems within isolated individuals rather than addressing the relational conditions that give rise to suffering. 3. People notice their emotional struggles connect to broader patterns, family systems, workplace dynamics, cultural pressures, historical trauma. 4. People sense that other cultures and historical periods have understood human flourishing differently and wonder what might be possible beyond the frameworks that dominate contemporary mental health discourse. This podcast offers something different. We're not trying to fix anyone or convince anyone that current approaches are wrong. Instead, we're creating space for shared inquiry into how language shapes experience and how different ways of understanding reality might serve our deepest needs for connection. We also had a second guiding question, which is, what can we explore together? 3 interconnected themes will guide our conversations. 1, recognition, exploring the possibility that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with us, even when we're struggling. What if our distress represents intelligent responses to conditions that have become incoherent rather than individual pathology requiring correction? Historical understanding, investigating how mental health frameworks emerged within specific cultural contexts and why they may no longer serve their original purpose. How do we distinguish between valuable knowledge and limiting assumptions embedded in our approaches to care? Practical application. Developing what we call relational literacy, the capacity to recognize how healing emerges through relationship and to create the conditions that support authentic connection and community. Recursive deepening. We'll return to foundational insights with greater complexity as our shared understanding develops. You'll hear conversations with practitioners, researchers, and community members who embody these principles in their daily lives. Most importantly, you'll witness authentic dialogue that demonstrates the vulnerable, transformative conversations we're exploring, showing how meaning shifts through a relationship rather than just describing it conceptually. So please, reflect on today's episode and generate some questions. I'll compile them for my weekly Substack posts. In the meantime, notice the language patterns in your next healthcare interaction or with family and friends. How are questions framed? Who controls the narrative? What reality is being constructed through the conversation? Try this small experiment. In your next important conversation, intentionally shift from declarative statements to open questions. How this changes the relational space. Reflect on a moment when someone's choice of words fundamentally shifted your experience of a situation. What changed and why did it happen? And please join our online community at info@integrativerelationalhealth.com to continue exploring how language shapes our experience of health, connection, and meaning. These invitations extend the conversation beyond passive listening to active engagement with the core concepts of language, relationship, and meaning. Thank you for joining me for Etymologies of Care. If today's conversation resonates, I invite you to share it and keep the dialogue alive in your own community. You can find resources, learn more about relational health, and connect with us at integrativerelationalhealth.com. Until next time, may you care for yourself and others